everyone. To everyone who has attended online, I see that the numbers adding up. So it's great to see so many people registered for this wonderful seminar. I think we have over 200 people registered. I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Lorraine Swords. She's an assistant professor in the School of Psychology and co-director of the Trinity Research in Childhood Centre. Laurie's background is in developmental psychology, but she has a particular interest in how exposure to potentially traumatic events or circumstances in early life can negatively impact upon a child's development and cast long shadows over their later adult lives and impact the lives of the next generation. I'd also like to introduce you to our second speaker in the seminar, which is Lamia. Lamia is a research assistant at the Trinity Institute of Neuroscience, and her thesis was focused on the intergenerational transmission of trauma through parenting. And she did that under the supervision of Dr. Lorraine Swords. We're really happy to have both of you here today to talk about the impact on adverse childhood experiences. And I will let you go ahead, Lorraine. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Imelda, and welcome everybody. I'm delighted to be here with Lamia this afternoon to talk to you all about parenting with a history of childhood or adverse childhood experiences. So Imelda said that my background is in developmental psychology, and anybody who has studied that topic and some of the key thinkers in the field, people like Jean Piaget and Erik Erikson and so on, you might be forgiven for thinking that childhood is like a sort of linear template, like I've depicted here, where you've got these normative patterns of development that go from childhood through to adulthood. However, as Michael Rutter says, viewing childhood transitions as ladder-like progressions through predictable stages can be a little bit misleading. So instead, childhood is sometimes a bit of an uncertain progression. It can be a little bit like a game of snakes and ladders at times. So children might be lucky enough to be bestowed with something positive in their lives. So they may have something like an easy temperament. They might have kind, caring parents. They might be part of a good, solid educational system. And these things give them a boost up or a leg up or a ladder towards a life goal and a more positive outcome. But there are some children who encounter, to use the analogy, maybe to overuse it, snakes in their young lives. So snakes might be in the form of being bullied or living through a worldwide pandemic or being caught up in a war. And these things stunt aspects of their development or set them back somewhat in their life plans. So these children who can be identified as being what we call at risk for a range of negative outcomes because of the hardships in their young lives, as I have put up here, there might be too many snakes and not enough ladders to support them in their development. And as researchers, we're really interested in studying these children and these circumstances to provide an evidence base to identify modifiable risk and protective factors, but also to identify populations that might need particular interventions. So this afternoon, we're going to talk about one type of risk. So I'd like to introduce you to the study of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. So ACEs are a way of conceptualizing and measuring potentially traumatic events that occur in childhood that can undermine children's sense of safety, that can undermine their sense of stability. And while there are many ways of conceptualizing and measuring different types of adversity, I'm going to describe this approach here, which was developed from research that first began 25 years ago in America by doctors Robert Anda and Vincent Felitti. And they devised one of the best known studies of childhood adversity using this measure. So this ACE scale I'm going to talk about, it asks adults if they can think back on their experiences as children and think back to their childhood, and if they experienced any of these 10 types of adversity. So you'll see that from the picture here, that 5 types of adversity are what we call personal. So they refer to being the victim of physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, being physically or emotionally neglected. And then 5 items are more related to other family members. It's classified as being, you're living in a household that had elements of dysfunction. So a family member had quite a significant mental illness, or somebody was in prison, there was domestic violence in the home, family members were engaging in substance use, or parents separated or divorced. So, for example, the question that's asked of participants, of the phrasing, how it works, if we were to take emotional abuse as an example, you would be asked, prior to your 18th birthday, did a parent or another adult in the household often or very often, that's the stem for all the questions, and then for emotional abuse, the question is, did they swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, or act in a way that made you afraid that you might be physically hurt? So each type of trauma listed here counts as one. And when you go to the ACE scale, you just tot up how many of these potentially traumatic experiences that you may have encountered. So a person who's been physically neglected, lived in a household with domestic violence, and had a parent in prison, for example, has an ACE score or an ACE count of 3. And at a population level, as you might imagine, there's individuals who have not experienced any of these ACEs, and there will be people who have experienced them all. So, like I said, it's 25 years ago since Anda and Filiti have begun their research using the ACE scale. Of course, research into childhood adversity was going on long before that point. But over the last 25 years since the seminal ACE study, there's been loads of research done, and I'm going to present you some key findings of that research in the next few minutes that give you a sense of the characteristics, I suppose, of ACEs. So the first point to make is that ACEs aren't uncommon, unfortunately. So if you were going to the items on the screen beforehand and you were totting up your own score, many people have accumulated at least one ACE. So generally it seems about 60% around the world are estimated to have experienced at least one form of childhood adversity. And the figure that you see here on the right-hand side, that's from a study that I did with some colleagues that was published this year. And this pie chart represents mothers attending a child and family service in Dublin and the number of ACEs that they reported. So you'll see that again, it's 36.5% said that they had no ACEs, which means that, similar to the other study by Madigan there, about 60-odd% had at least one ACE. So you'll see the percentage that experience one ACE, 2, or right up to 4 or more. Now, another unfortunate characteristic of ACEs is that they tend to co-occur. So as it says here, given an exposure of to one category of ACE, there is an 80% likelihood of exposure to another. Now, you can imagine how some ACEs might relate to each other, or one might cause another, for example. So if you live in a household with domestic violence, there's probably a heightened chance that children may have been exposed to some form of physical or emotional abuse, or they've been neglected. Maybe some of the parents are dealing with mental health issues as a result of the domestic abuse. So you see sometimes these kind of clusters or constellations of ACEs appearing. And although results are a little bit mixed, there's 2 patterns of ACE clustering that we tend to see. And there seems to be 2 main groups of children that come out of the research, and they are children who have either extremely low numbers of ACEs, and then unfortunately there's a cluster of children that seem to have an extremely high probability of experiencing ACEs. And if you look at the chart, the table there, I've pulled that from a report that I wrote with Professor Trevor Spratt and Deville Vilda a number of years ago. And this represents, you can see, I think, 8 children here that were, their families were participating in a child and a family service in Dublin. And on an individual level, you can see, for example, child 1, she has a total ACE score of 6. So this child has experienced substance abuse in her family, her parents are separated, there's mental illness in her home, one of her parents was involved in criminal activity, there's been psychological abuse, physical abuse, and so on. The lowest example there of an ACE score is participant number 8. And then the highest is participant number 4 that has experienced all 10 of the ACEs that were asked of their parent. We asked their parents to report which of the list of ACEs their child had experienced. And bearing in mind that normally ACEs, your ACE count is based on everything you've experienced up to the age of 18 years of age. The data that we've collected for this particular table here was asked of parents to report on behalf of their children, and many of those children were still in primary school. They hadn't got to 18 years of age, so there was still, unfortunately, plenty of time for them to accumulate more ACEs. So, you can imagine how experiencing multiple adversities can impact upon children's lives in the here and now, and indeed the impact of abuse and neglect and difficult family circumstances on children has been widely researched in terms of how it affects their emotional development and their education and their physical health and so on. However, a particularly interesting feature of ACEs is their long-term impact. You expect bad things happening to children now will affect children now, but it's how it's affecting them as they move into adulthood, or as Imelda says, this kind of the fact that ACEs cast long shadows forward into adulthood has been a bit of a revelation in this research over the last number of years. So studies have shown that if you experience adverse childhood experiences, you're much more likely to report injuries in adulthood, as it says here, fractures, burns. You're more likely to report poorer levels of mental health. It's linked with unintended pregnancy and pregnancy complications. It's associated with acquiring infectious diseases like HIV. It's linked with chronic diseases like coronary heart disease, diabetes. It's linked with more risky behaviors like substance use, and so on and so on. So linked to that point, I suppose, is the fact that ACEs have a cumulative effects. And as I say here, there's a dose-response relationship between ACEs and a whole host of negative health and well-being outcomes. So in particular, we seem to notice that if you have a score of 4 or more, it's almost like a tipping point where it's harder to bounce back and show resilience in the face of such adversity. And you can imagine if you're a child and one bad thing happens to you, with the right support around you, and it's more likely that you can kind of deal with it, learn some coping skills, gain some resilience and bounce back. But if another thing is knocking you down, and maybe a third thing, it's just harder to keep getting back up and fighting these situations. So it's quite arbitrary, but this idea of 4 or more adversities are associated with heightened levels of risk. So as I say here, there's a dose-response relationship, which I'll show you here now. So it's almost like steps of stairs. So here's the association between adverse childhood experiences and engaging in smoking as an adult. So you can see that the more ACEs you've accumulated, the more likely it is that you will smoke. Here's childhood experiences that underlie suicide attempts. So if you have 1, 2, 3, 4 or more ACEs, you'll see how that's associated with a higher percentage of attempted suicides. This is ACEs and adult alcoholism, and the same pattern. So across a whole range of outcomes relating to mental health, physical health, behaviors in adulthood, like risky behaviors, fast driving, unprotected sex, and a whole host of issues like that could be detrimental for people's health and well-being. You see this graded dose-response relationship between ACEs and the various outcomes being studied. Now, you might be asking, how does something that happens in your childhood increase the risk for poor outcomes in later life? And there's lots of avenues of research looking into this, particularly in relation to later physical health outcomes. So one proposal is that childhood adversity is a distal factor that exerts its influence through more proximal risk factors. So that just means that it is something that happened in the past, but its influence affects you now as an adult because of how it relates to circumstances of your environment or your health in the here and now. So as an example, you know, if you have experienced a lot of adversity as a child, and perhaps you're not going to school as regularly as you should be, maybe you've dropped out of school early, that might be associated with lower educational attainment. That can be linked with fewer, if any, qualifications. That can be associated with a lower occupational position, or at least a lower income. And then lower income is associated with a whole host of material conditions, or poor material conditions in adulthood, like you know, poor substandard housing, maybe poor dietary quality, and so on. A second proposal is that children who grow up in risky social environments may develop specific types of coping styles, emotional regulation strategies, and social cognitions that both increase stress exposure and shape the manner in which they respond to stress. So, for example, if you have this belief that the world is out to get me, or I have to get my retaliation in first, or whatever it might be, that can result in a really highly reactive emotional state. So you're always primed to look out for other people's bad intentions. So there's heightened levels of anger, heightened levels of hostility, and these emotions and a heightened level of reactive emotional state is associated with increased susceptibility to disease in adulthood, and it's linked with these psychobiological pathways in relation to your neuroendocrine system or your immune system that can affect your long-term health. So, for example, chronic activation of your stress response system can cause imbalances in a whole array of biochemicals, and ultimately result in greater wear or tear on your body, and that increases your vulnerability to disease. Now, in more recent years, there's been a turn to looking at intergenerational transmission of trauma. So we know that exposure to traumatic events or circumstances in early life can negatively impact upon the children that are experiencing them in the here and now. We know it can impact upon those children's lives as adults, but now we're learning that the effects can seep into the next generation, so that a mother who experienced ACEs, that experience can affect her children. So studies that have begun to use this approach suggest that the greater number of ACEs accumulated by mothers is associated with a higher likelihood of a range of issues presenting in their children. So I have some examples listed there, like children will report poorer mental health outcomes. They report behavioral difficulties in terms of managing their own behavior, peer relationship issues, sleep disruption, general poor quality of life. And there's less research on this, but mothers' ACEs is associated with their children's ACEs. So assessment of ACEs among parents can act as an early indicator of children's difficulties, and can be used to inform some interventions. We can talk about that a little bit later on. So this slide just shows some recent work that I've done exploring the mechanisms through which the intergenerational transmission of ACEs operates. So, excuse me. So first, in this research that we published this year with Professor Trevor Spratt and Dr. Mary Kennedy, who's based in UCD at the moment, we looked at the association between mothers' ACEs and children's difficulties, and we assessed difficulties in a kind of global, general way, looking at children's like high levels of emotional reactivity, difficulties with their peer relationships, behavioural difficulties, conduct difficulties. So a kind of a broad look at children's various emotional and behavioural difficulties. So first, we noted that mothers' ACEs predicted their children's socio-emotional and behavioural difficulties. The more ACEs mothers had, the poorer these outcomes were. And then we explored the role of mothers' mental health. So we know that having a history of ACEs has been linked to an increased risk of mothers experiencing mental health conditions such as depression, anxiety disorder. It's associated with obsessive compulsive disorder. It's associated with PTSD, with post-traumatic stress disorder. And then we know that maternal mental health is a significant predeterminant of parenting behavior. So if mothers are experiencing bouts of ill health in relation to their mental health, their ability to be a sensitive, responsive caregiver is put under pressure. They might be less able to provide discipline, meet their children's basic needs, model appropriate emotional regulation skills, all the things that we highlight as being key tasks for a parent to do and to model for their child. So mental health has an impact on parenting behavior. And of course, we know that parents' own childhood experiences can influence what we call their internal working models about how to be a parent, or their like the blueprint they have of how do I parent this child that I have. So if you're a parent and you can reference positive experiences from your childhood involving, you know, warm and responsive caregiving, you're well positioned then to kind of recreate these experiences for your own children. However, if your childhood experiences are associated with neglect and abuse or other adversity, this can become your kind of roadmap or your tendency, shall we say, of how to parent, or at least it can shape your expectations about how parents respond to children's needs. So these are some of the pathways between mothers' ACEs and children's difficulties. So in our research, I didn't put in all the detailed stats figures here, but there was a significant direct effect between mothers' ACEs and children's difficulties, but there was all these indirect effects happening as well. So if you're thinking about using some kind of conceptual model like this to guide any sort of intervention work, you know, mothers' ACEs, if we know that's associated with their children's difficulties, the mothers' ACEs have already happened, so there's very little you can do to target that. But what you might be able to target is their mental health, how to support them, how to improve their mental health. And you can also, that will hopefully have a positive impact on their parenting behavior, but parenting can also be a target for intervention. Okay, one last slide before I move on and pass you over to Lamia, and that's just to make the point that as research has advanced and we've more and more studies to lean on in this area, we're just learning that ACEs are really complicated. Although the last slide I just presented talks about the pathways linking ACEs with poor outcomes, I don't want to have this idea that ACEs are very deterministic, that if I've accumulated 4, 5, 6 ACEs, whatever it is, you know, you are at heightened risk to poor outcomes, but there's lots of protective factors or promoter factors that should be considered in any relationship between ACEs and later outcome. So these kind of protective factors, something that Lamia will talk about in the second half of the talk, but these are just factors that kind of buffer the negative impact of ACEs or can protect children about the negative impact of ACEs. And I've taken a graphic from this 2021 study, which kind of shows the bad stuff in the rain cloud coming down on children, but then there's good stuff in the umbrella that the child is hopefully standing under, and that will help a lot of the rain to bounce off and away from them as opposed to landing on them. And what was I going to say about alternative measurements? Oh, yes. So what I've presented here is just talking about ACEs as a total count. So it's your ACE score. And that's one way we've done a lot of research in this topic. But there's other research that would look at particular types of ACEs and look at, maybe the outcomes associated with experiencing childhood sexual abuse is very different from the outcomes associated with experiencing other types of ACEs, like living in a home with domestic violence. So I just wanted to note that I'm aware that what I've presented you is called the lumping approach to ACE measurement and studying ACEs, because you're literally lumping all the ACEs together. And of course, and each ACE gets a count of 1, but sure, they're not all the same. And, this ACE score does not take into consideration things like the severity of the experience, how long it happened for. Did it happen just 5 times when you were 4 years of age? Did it happen 4 times a week for your whole 18 years of your, the first 18 years of your life? It doesn't talk about timing. So what age were you when you experienced ACE? It doesn't talk about duration. So there's all these other kind of characteristics that need to be taken into account. But at a population level, it's really hard to assess all of that. So an ACE count is a useful, quick, and actually is quite an informative, what we call like a shorthand way of assessing people's ACEs. Anyhow, I've talked a lot about the bad stuff, and Lamia is going to talk more about protective factors and some research that she did on this topic. So I'll pass over to Lamia now.
Thank you, Lorraine, for that in-depth introduction on ACEs and their effects. As Lorraine explained, there is an intergenerational aspect to ACEs, unfortunately, but recently the concept of benevolent childhood experiences has been introduced to ACEs research as a potential safeguard against the transmission of ACEs between generations. Positive childhood experiences would be things like attachment to caregivers. I just want to ask, can you see that the Zoom bar, is it in the middle of my screen? I'm just going to, sorry.
It looks fine, Lamia. I can just see
great.
yeah.
Thank you so much. So positive childhood experiences would be things like attachment to caregivers, positive peer relations, and a positive sense of self. Experiences like this have been found to counteract adverse childhood experiences. So we think that the emergence of positive childhood experiences as an adaptive capacity against ACEs should be explored as a tool for psychological change to help break the cycle of inherited trauma between generations. So as Lorraine mentioned, her and I recently published work on this, and that's what I'll be going through now. Benevolent childhood experiences, what are they? So positive or benevolent childhood experiences are early favorable experiences that elicit resilience in the individual. They encapsulate feelings of safety, support, and attachment throughout childhood. Conceptually, they exist as a counterpart to ACEs and have been established as a viable source for positive growth for those with a history of childhood trauma. While adverse and benevolent childhood experiences often co-occur in childhood, ACEs research has shown that even within high-risk cases, positive childhood experiences drastically counteract the negative effects of maltreatment in childhood. For example, among maltreated children, secure attachment to an extended family member or good peer relations are associated with greater resilience and lower levels of psychopathology in adulthood. Resilience research has also defined positive childhood experiences as promotive factors that directly reduce the risk of unfavorable outcomes in both low and high risk ACE individuals. So research examining the mitigating effects of benevolent childhood experiences in pregnant women has also been very promising. So as Lorraine explained, ACEs kind of begin, or the transmission of ACEs begin in utero through the attachment to the fetus, that kind of thing. Also, pregnancy is a very transformative period for women, and research has shown that childhood experiences or childhood memories become very latent during this time. So recent research has found that women who are pregnant who have ACEs who draw upon their positive childhood experiences can mitigate the effects of transferring their ACEs onto their children. Yeah, so moreover, as mothers with a history of benevolent childhood experiences have fewer physical and mental health problems, the transmission of ACEs through parenting is mitigated greatly. And that is the kind of intergenerational aspect that we're talking about today. So in our study, we chose to use a qualitative approach because we felt that the topic of mothering with a history of childhood trauma was, we just felt that a qualitative approach would be better at getting the nuances of what that is like. So we recruited from a parenting support service that works alongside the Child Protection and Social Work Department. The service provides practical support and preparation for independent living for lone parents through parenting workshops and interventions. So the idea was to recruit from a pool of participants that we felt would have a number of ACEs and investigate their positive childhood experiences. 3 mothers participated in the study, although we did reach out to 7 mothers. 7 was the capacity of the service, but only 3 agreed to be interviewed. With this small sample size, we felt that interpretive phenomenological analysis was the best method of analysis to carry out because it allows for smaller sample sizes and sees smaller sample sizes as an opportunity for an in-depth exploration of participant experiences. So what we did was we gave the participants the adverse childhood experiences scale and then the benevolent childhood experiences scale to complete and report how many experiences were applicable to them in each scale. This was done to confirm and contextualize their experiences of ACEs and benevolent childhood experiences. And the subsequent interview aspect of the study explored the influence of benevolent childhood experiences in mitigating the transmission of their ACEs through their parenting. And the interviews lasted 30 to 40 minutes. Sorry, I was meant to switch over. So that was actually our interview schedule. If you want to have a quick look at that. Sorry, I forgot to change the slide. I'll just leave that up for a few seconds. So our results. So ACE scores within this sample ranged from 4 to 7, indicating early adversity across all 3 participants. So if we think back to what Lorraine explained earlier, 4 or more is kind of the threshold for high childhood adversity. With regards to benevolent childhood experience scores, the original study found that in a sample of 101 pregnant women, the average benevolent childhood experience score was 7. Participants in this study reported only experiencing between 1 and 6, and 2 out of 3 participants had an ACE score that exceeded their benevolent childhood experience score. Analysis of the interview data revealed three superordinate themes related to participants' benevolent childhood experiences, their children's benevolent childhood experiences, and their desire to break the cycle of intergenerational trauma. I'm just going to go through some of the results of the interviews. Pseudonyms were used for the participants, and I hope that after this talk, you can maybe go back and look at the paper itself, because there are some really good quotes in there that I unfortunately couldn't include in this because of timing. So the first theme, is replicating positive experiences. So both Lauren and Alison expressed that they make conscious effort to replicate the positive experiences of their childhood with their children now. While their circumstances in terms of wealth and space are significantly worse than what they experienced in childhood, Lauren and Alison try to reproduce their positive childhood experiences as best as they can. Quote, "We do a lot of messy play because I was always out in the back garden and we don't have a garden, but I always out making mud pies and everything like that. I fill the drawer with shaving foam and cosmetics, and she's very happy to just pour loads of stuff together and make potions and things like that." Alison's experiences were centered around the closeness she had with her mother and siblings. She shared that her relationship with her father was always strained as he physically abused her, but the emotional closeness she had with her mother and siblings was a positive aspect of her childhood. Although she is a lone parent now with no close family nearby, Alison explained that she tried to replicate the experiences that helped her feel close to her mother and with her child now. Quote, "The positive aspects were my mum. Whenever she had time to be with us, it was one of the best days. I just imagine the days we would get to sleep with her in her room when our dad was traveling. All of us would just come. She had a very big bed. So I just feel like each time me and child's name are also together, it's like that. I say, come to mommy's bed. We used to get so much joy out of those kind of things." I just think that that quote in particular and the previous quote they're just very beautiful insights into how hard these mothers are really trying to make sure that they don't kind of replicate the parenting that they experienced, and that they're trying to pass on the positive memories that they had. So this was our second theme, creating new positive experiences. So this second theme, I think at first glance, is seemingly quite similar to the first theme, but it's more focused on the mother's desire to center her own relationship with her child as a unique relationship. And I think that's one of the good things about the method of analysis that we use, is that it really allows for nuance in what is being said by the participants. So participants shared a strong desire to ensure their relationships with their children were open and focused on creating positive experiences. Participants emphasized allowing their children to take the lead and spending time together so that activities are centered around their own wants and needs, and also expressed a want to create positive experiences that they did not experience as children. For example, Nicola explained that a lot of positive feelings and experiences were lacking in her childhood, and wants to make sure that her child now feels fulfilled and happy through the time that they spend together. Quote, "It feels good that I'm able to give him something that I wasn't able to have. Like he'd be a lot happier than I was as a child. Because of summer holidays, we're sort of making fun out of like the little things, like getting him sand and water, more sensory things, what I wouldn't have done as a kid, like more outdoor things that I wouldn't have done as a kid either. But it's more about making little memories out of little things." So this was our final theme, protecting children from intergenerational trauma. This third theme was really interesting in that all three participants had such great insight about their childhoods and expressed wanting to protect their children from what they had endured as children. So Alison shared that reflecting on the trauma she experienced from her father helped her gain insight into the type of parent she did not want to be. She made it very clear that the parenting she experienced from her father was not going to be passed on to her child now. This realization also influenced her to leave her abusive ex-partner. Quote, my dad was a really big beater. He liked to beat a lot, you know. So when I think of what he used to do to me, like, it really makes me be very careful with the way I treat my baby, because I feel it can affect them. Beating was very normal. A baby could spill water there now, and they would beat the baby for spilling the water. They feel the baby needs to be intelligent. I want to protect him from fighting, like I experienced my mum and dad fighting a lot, like every day. The environment was always tense. I don't think I would like my child to live in that kind of environment. I just prefer to raise him alone. Lauren and Nicola expressed that their insight was solely brought on by their experiences of bad parenting. Lauren spoke about the control she experienced from her parents, and Nicola shared that the biggest influence to her parenting was her mum's addiction and trauma, and the trauma she endured from being exposed to it. I don't drink, I won't take any prescriptions I could get addicted to, because there is that addictive gene in my family, and I just wouldn't like him to go through what I went through as a kid. So I stay away from alcohol and stuff like that. When I went to a new doctor, the first thing I told him when we were having like our consult, I don't want him to prescribe things that are addictive, like anything that has benzos or stuff, because there is that addictive gene there. In the paper itself, there are some really interesting insights from Lauren that I couldn't include because of timing, but she explains that her upbringing was very controlled, and her realization of this has greatly influenced her parenting, as she really champions her daughter's autonomy, encourages her to take the lead when they're playing and things like that. So if you have time after this talk, I would really encourage you guys to just even read the results section, because they're just some lovely insights from these women, and we're very grateful that they agreed to have us interview them. So I think this is my last slide. So what can we do with this information? The findings of this study, namely that participants intentionally tried to recreate and create positive experiences with their own children, supports the idea that benevolent childhood experiences are a legitimate source of adaptive capacity for mothers with ACEs. As previously mentioned, the nature of these internal positive experiences as potential tools for resilience means that mothers can recreate positive caregiving moments from their experiences without having to rely on any external factors for support. We hope that these findings can be used to help prevent the transmission of ACEs between generations within assessment and screening contexts for mothers. For example, where benevolent childhood experiences exist in mothers, a strength-based approach should be taken to harness the adaptive capacity of these benevolent childhood experiences. And in the instance of low benevolent childhood experiences, more parental support and education should be offered to the individual. So that's all I have to contribute. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Lamia and Laurie, for your talk. There's been lots of very interesting questions coming in. And if I could start with the first one, which is from Rosella. Hi, I'm wondering why violence and abuse towards fathers are not counted as an ACE.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Will I answer that, Lamia?
Yeah.
Yeah. I suppose to answer that, Rosella, when you're reading any study that looks at ACEs, it's important that you look at how they measured ACEs, because the original ACE scale talks about violence towards mothers, but not fathers. But a lot of research since has adapted that and does ask about violence within the home, that no matter what direction it's going in. So it's any kind of interparental domestic abuse. So in the research I do myself, we use a 12-item ACE scale, and one of those additional items is it asks about violence that children have witnessed from mothers towards fathers, or in same-sex relationships, any violence that goes on between parents. And maybe just to make that point, like the original ACE scale, there's lots not included in that other researchers since have added. Like childhood adversity could be 100 items long, unfortunately. So some researchers now add poverty as an item. They add bullying in school as an item. So any piece of research you read, always check how they measure ACEs, because they're not all the exact same.
Yeah, because social determinants has such an influence on child's health and well-being. Thank you for that, Laurie. Another question related to that one from Aoife Dolan is, has there been much research on fathers' ACEs and the impact on children? I think you may have answered that already, or?
Yeah, there's not as much. It's I think the topic, the intergenerational transmission of ACEs, is fairly new, and there definitely is less published on fathers' ACEs and impacts on children. But the research that's out there would show that they do have, fathers' ACEs do impact upon children in terms of, I think there's studies talking about impacts on children's anxiety, sleep disturbance, and childhood anger is a key outcome that they've studied. So looking at associations between more ACEs among fathers and hostility and anger in their children. And they also look at those mediating variables that I talked about in my slide, how fathers' ACEs impacts their mental health and also negatively impacts upon their parenting skills as well. But there's more to be done on that topic for sure.
And another question related to that, and I think you may have answered it, it's from Louise McCulloch, is, does fathers' ACEs impact in the same way as mothers?
Yeah, it's a bit of a controversial topic. I've done some research myself which shows that that the predictive power, or I would say the impact of mothers' ACEs is stronger on their children, but that not all studies find that. So there's certainly more work to be done on that topic.
Okay. Somebody's asked about the slides. The webinar will be recorded and will be available next week, and the slides will be on that. Justin has asked a question, is there a parenting program that works well for those parents who have high ACE scores, who are triggered by trauma when they're parenting their children? He said he meets a lot of mothers who are diagnosed with emotionally unstable borderline personality disorders and finds that they get very, very little support from the mental health services. So I suppose his question is there a parenting program that works well for parents with these high ACE scores?
In my own experience, I've just worked with general family intervention programs that would do almost like a check on parents' ACEs, and I suppose like a trauma-informed care approach, and consider that when delivering the interventions. But I'm not sure if it's ACE, if the program itself is ACE informed. I don't know, Lami, have you, in the work you did with the mothers, would there be much talk about early experiences, and would you tailor your parenting courses accordingly, or parenting interventions accordingly?
Yeah, we definitely did tailor them to the individual. But I suppose the nature of the work that, or the research that Trick do and the study that we did, is that we're trying to maybe promote that more interventions to address ACEs are kind of worked on. So I wouldn't know of any specific interventions, but I think from service to service, I would hope that people do take, in the service I worked in anyway, it was very dependent on the case and the mother, and that kind of, we altered things for the ACEs that they had and things like that.
So you kind of individualized it to the actual parent. That's helpful to know. Lamia. A similar question coming on is from Aoife Dolan. In parenting work, is it important to acknowledge or speak to parents about their ACEs? Is it helpful for them to acknowledge them and the impact it has on their parenting? So it's kind of saying, do you bring that up with parents in parenting programs?
I would have in the past, and in the service that I worked in, we would have done that. I think the psychoeducational element of it is really important. And I think as well, the process of identifying the ACEs that the mothers have is also really validating. I think, unfortunately, with a lot of people, they mightn't have the vocabulary or the tools to identify the experiences that they went through as children. So I think it's always very helpful to go through the races and just to explain them, and it's very validating as well, I've found.
Great. Thanks, Lamia. Niamh Byrne has asked a question. Other than the risk of developing mental health difficulties, such as depression, anxiety, and PTSD into adulthood, what is the association between ACEs and personality disorders, such as ASPD, NPD, and BPD? These are all the tricky questions.
It's interesting. I was actually reading an article just published this year by a woman called, I'm sure I'm not pronouncing her name correctly, but it's Rosalie Brokoff, I think, Broekof. But she was looking, it was a really interesting study where they something like 8,000 adolescents, and they were looking at associations between ACEs and personality disorder. And I think the strongest predictor of later onset personality disorder was experiencing emotional abuse in childhood. And it's some finding, like, I was going to say, don't quote me, but here I'm quoting myself probably inaccurately, but I think it was something like 90% of children, of adolescents who went on to develop personality disorder had experienced ACEs in their childhood. So there was a really strong link there. I hope I'm right in quoting that, but I only read it a couple of weeks ago and it was quite a strong finding. So Rosalie Brokoff, yeah. So there is some links there. There are some links there.
We have some lovely comments coming in from attendees. Lisa said, congratulations on your research, Lamia and Laurie. Heartbreaking, but also uplifting to hear the stories of those women. Sinead Tobin, excellent presentation, so informative. Thank you, Laurie and Lama. And Liz Nixon and various other people say, great talk. Kira Carrick says, my gosh, I love that. Would love to see the results implemented. Like her findings have suggested, could do so much for society and future generations. I'm curious to what you might think causes some women to actively break the cycle while others don't realize the need to break it. That's quite a good point there. What do you think, Laurie? Why some mothers choose to break it and others don't?
Yeah, it's a great question. I was going to see that Lamia have an answer to that because she works more closely with the actual the mothers involved than I would. So for interactions, Lamia, do you have any insight into that?
It was, I think it kind of boiled down to individual differences, which is kind of a cop-out answer, I think. But that was something I struggled to figure out was why, because in parenting psychology, it kind of promotes the idea that people parent as they were parented. But these three women were really keen on not parenting how they were parented. So I really can't tell you where that insight comes from. I really can't. I think we might have a paragraph about resilience and how individual differences in resilience affect people's insight into their parenting and how they were parented. If I'm remembering correctly, that is in our paper. So maybe if you had a look at that, but yeah, I'm really not sure is the short answer. But it is a really good question and a really puzzling question as well.
Wow, we have so much interest from the panelists and so many questions, but I'll try and get through a few more because we're close to finishing. Richard Layard just mentioned that evidence from studies on extracurricular activities such as sports in childhood shows that it's particularly beneficial to low-income children who've experienced adversity. So developing relationships outside of home may be a good intervention.
Yeah.
Just a point to think about.
Yeah, great point. Yeah, kind of it goes back. I think it's on one of the benevolent or the positive childhood experiences is even having that one good adult. So even if within your home there's lots of difficulty and the relationships aren't so good, having a teacher or somebody in your community that you can lean on. But that's really interesting, Richard. Yeah.
Louise McCulloch just said, I wonder if you come across the idea of intensive mothering and whether that impacts mothers with high ACEs. Intensive mothering. She came, yeah.
Mm.
Or the importance of creating new narratives for self and identity. And also said, thanks for the presentation, excellent and super interesting.
Thanks, Louise. Yeah, like the term I'm familiar with, but not that particular study you mentioned there. But yeah, it sounds really interesting. So that was I'm just reading your message, Mothers with Addiction Recovery. Okay, yeah, certainly I'll look into that. It sounds really interesting and a positive avenue to research, I suppose, to lead to more positive outcomes.
Kira Carrick asked, when saying ACEs in parents impact kids, is this just in terms of them parenting their child, or is it passed on biological? Are some ACEs passed on biological? Interesting point.
It is a really interesting point. So the whole field of epigenetics is developing at the moment, and I'm not an expert in that at all, but the whole idea that you can pass on biologically a trauma to your children is in its infancy, that area of research at the moment. As I talked about, I'm more into the kind of social processes, but certainly it's almost like nature nurture. It's not all one or the other. There's obviously an interplay of factors going on there, and I think researching more in that area will be really fascinating in the times ahead.
Okay, there's so many other questions. Hard to, I would see, could we include maybe one more? When will your paper be available publicly? Do they mean the talk? Do you mean the talk? Because your paper's already been published. I think they might mean this talk and video, which will be available next week.
Maybe is the paper open access, Lami? I'm not sure. Maybe it is open access. Okay. So if you go into Google Scholar for the paper, sometimes if you try to get the paper just normally, it says you have to pay for it, what have you. But I think there should be a PDF of it available online. But I'm sure if you contact myself or Lamia, we can send it to you if you want to read the paper. But Imelda, you were saying that the presentation today, is it next week?
Will be available next week. Many people said thanks for such a wonderful talk, absolutely wonderful. Dr. Michael Connell said wonderful talk, it's helpful, of interest to colleagues. He's published a paper reviewing brief measures of childhood adversity to inform service planning, and the link is there. Jason Leary suggested therapeutic parenting, cycle of security, and DPP are all good for parents. So there's so many there. It's, you know, we couldn't get to them all. We got to the main ones. I think if people want to follow up, they could contact either Laurie or Lamia. Is that okay?
Sure.
With some questions. I know, because this is very much your area of expertise. I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank you so much for a wonderful talk, and to all the attendees for their active engagement. This is the first seminar in the TRICS seminar series, which I think was a great success. Our next one is on the 2nd of December, and the advertisement will be coming out shortly about that. We are lucky to have Dr. Christian Connell, who will talk about the effects of maltreatment on children, and he's from Penn State University, and it will be a hybrid event in person and online from 1 to 2:30 on Monday, the 2nd of December. So that leaves me just to sign off and say thank you so much again, Lorraine and Lamia, and to Jenny Ryan for facilitating the webinar. Have a good Friday.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.